to the 17th annual Newburyport Literary Festival. This is our third virtual festival. I'm Leslie Hendrickson. I'm on the steering committee of the festival. It's my pleasure to introduce Alena Dillon, who is the author of Mercy House, a Library Journal Best Book of 2020, which has been optioned as a television series produced by Amy Schumer. The Happiest Girl in the World, a Good Morning America pick. My Body is a Big Fat Temple, a memoir of pregnancy and early parenting. And Eyes Turn Skyward, a forthcoming novel. Her work has appeared in publications including The Daily Beast, Parents Magazine, Lit Hub, River Teeth, Slice Magazine, The Rumpus, and Bustle. She teaches creative writing and lives on the North Shore of Boston with her husband, son, and Black Lab. Aileen Weintraub is an award-winning journalist, author, and editor. She's written for the Washington Post, Glamour, NBC, and the AARP, among others. She has also published several different children's books, including Never Too Young, 50 Unstoppable Kids Who Made a Difference, and We Got Game, 35 female authors who changed the world. It's female athletes, excuse me. Kate Rope is an award-winning freelance journalist and author whose work has appeared in many publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time, and CNN. She is the author of Strong as a Mother, How to Be Happy, Healthy, and Most Importantly, Sane From Pregnancy to Parenthood, and co-executive producer of Soldiers of Science, the Vietnam War, Anthony Fauci, and the Doctors Who Revolutionized American Medicine, an Audible original documentary that she co-wrote with narrator Alan Alda. She lives in Atlanta with her husband and 2 daughters. I am going to put more information about these authors and their books in the chat, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Kate. Thank you so much for being here, everyone.
Thanks, Leslie, and welcome everyone, and thanks for being here. It's a huge honor because I love both these books. And I won't talk too much. We'll let the authors talk, but they're both very different, and they both really immersed me in the experience of pregnancy in totally different ways. I feel like Aileen, like if you look at her farmhouse backdrop right now, I felt like I was in her farmhouse with her alone in a bed experiencing a bedridden pregnancy, and it was immersive in that way. And Alena was sort of coming out punching throughout throughout her memoir, and I was just like, yeah, all the points she was making about the politics of motherhood, from the very tiny things to the big things. So anyway, we'll have a great conversation, and I know we're not going to get to like a tenth of what these books bring up for us as a society and for us as you as women and moms, but I think it'll be great. So I think we're going to start with Alena doing a reading.
Yeah, I'm just going to give a little taste of the book. So I chose the title essay, My Body is a Big Fat Temple, kind of because I'm approaching this milestone. It's at 37 weeks and it's about halfway through. My book goes from like prior to pregnancy to when my son is 2 years old. So it's kind of right in the midpoint. And it's a little glimpse into what I have to expect since it's like 2 weeks away for me now because I'm currently pregnant. So here we go. At this point, I'm held together by crusty gum and shoestring. Pain bayonets my back. My snoring sounds gas-powered, as am I. Constipation is so severe, I occasionally check the toilet in the hopes that I gave birth. My crotch muscles are glaciers. Well, except for the leakage. Nobody speaks of the leakage. The degree of dizziness I experience is enough to cause windburn. Since I also happen to be starving, which makes sense since the baby is now growing half a pound a week, increasing his body mass like Christian Bale preparing to play Batman, I figure it might be low blood sugar and begin eating every 2 hours. For the first time in my life, I can argue that a brownie is for my health. I touch my belly like a mother goddess and murmur, for the baby, with fudge lodged between my teeth. The extra food doesn't appease the vertigo, so I call my doctor. I say, the room literally spins for 6 or 7 seconds at a time. I have to grab something to stay upright. I suggest you avoid places where passing out might be dangerous, she answers. Doctors are so concerned with pregnant women falling, I'm surprised they haven't prescribed us training wheels. Yet there's no attempt to pin down the source of my lightheadedness. Only in pregnancy, the grand mystery bag of ailments, where anything goes, do MDs hear such a range of conditions that they shrug at every infirmity, consider the preposterous normal, and don't bother searching for a cure. They do want to see me a week later, however, when my underwear is saturated by what we assume to be amniotic fluid. If my water has broken, the baby could be exposed to infection. I rush to their office. Don't worry, it's just pee. According to my pregnancy app, my uterus has grown by 1,000%. I don't know why this is significant, but it feels worth mentioning. We are out to dinner with some friends when all my muscles seize at once. My body is a broken down jalopy. I pull off-road and ask Phil to roll me home. I'm so fatigued, the workout video today isn't so much prenatal bar as prenatal lie on the rug and stare at the ceiling while everyone on screen continues the routine. Yet I'll soon perform the most physically demanding feat of my life. What I've been told is the caloric equivalent to running a marathon. I'm about as ready for it as Jim Gaffigan is to fight Ivan Drago. My hands and wrists are stiff and swollen. Luckily, I removed my wedding rings so I didn't end up in the emergency room, weeping over 2 bands of gold sawed off my sausage-link fingers. Despite ditching these marks of commitment, bachelors aren't tackling me on the street. Good thing, because my puffy ankles couldn't take the impact. Some women develop clown feet that never quite reduce. They have to invest in an entirely new petty wardrobe. I've also acquired Popeye arm, or what Phil affectionately calls my meat paw. From the elbow down, I look like I could work at an Italian deli, crack open a Budweiser bottle without an opener, or shape horseshoes from raw iron. My prenatal masseuse actually asked if I was a welder. Thanks to this inflammation, I could cross another condition off my pregnancy bingo card: carpal tunnel syndrome. Arm swelling squeezes the carpal tunnel and strangles the median nerve, a tangle of roots that runs from the neck through a wrist tunnel that really should come with hardier walls. Carpal tunnel syndrome is hereditary, as some people's tunnels are more accommodating than others. My mother had carpal tunnel syndrome in pregnancy and eventually required surgery. Apparently, our line of carpal tunnels are skinny and get easily crowded, like the Lincoln Tunnel. Perhaps I should be grateful that there is something skinny about me, and that at least I'm not a passageway from Manhattan to New Jersey. The syndrome presents numbness in my middle finger, but rapidly progresses to tingling and aching in my entire right hand, which by all appearances could belong to Mike Tyson. Now my fingers are stiff and difficult to bend. I can't open a jar or hold a cup of coffee, so I lower my face and slurp it like soup. As with most pregnancy ailments, there is no cure but delivery. I still have 3 weeks to go. My body is a big fat temple, a holy place a squatter desecrated by making himself comfortable and practicing, by all accounts, his martial arts. Well, kid, consider this your eviction notice. Thanks.
That's great. Okay, so how about something from you, Aileen?
Sure. Alena, that was brilliant. It was so wonderful to hear and listen to, and it resonated so much. And so my book is Knocked Down, a High-Risk Memoir. And so I'm going to talk about, you talked so much about the physical aspects of pregnancy. And so this excerpt talks about the emotional aspects of pregnancy. And so I'm on bed rest for about 10 weeks at this point. So my entire bed rest sentence was 5 months, and I'm 10 weeks in, and I'm starting to really suffer from perinatal depression and perinatal anxiety. And I'm consumed with this sense of shame that I've already failed as a mother before I've even had a chance to become a mother, because my body is failing me. Emotionally, I'm a mess. And that's when my own mother steps in and shows me what it really means to be a mother. The doorbell was stuck as usual, and I knew it would take me a solid 2 minutes to get out of bed to answer it. Sachi Red was running in circles and rolling her head along the ground like she was possessed. When I finally opened the door, though the bell was still ringing, there was only a brown box sitting on the welcome mat. I unstuck the bell, picked up the box, and glanced over at Sachi Red, who predictably had a thin string of drool on either side of her chops. And I imagined that if she could speak, she would say, "This bell is trying to kill us." I stuck my head around the corner and saw Charlie Chaplin, UPS guy, sitting in his truck. He waved at me with a smile before pulling away. The mystery box had no return address. After struggling back into bed, I opened it, hoping to find something glamorous. The inner package was wound tight in 5 layers of bubble wrap and sealed with silver duct tape. It was either incredibly fragile or explosive. Several minutes into deconstructing the wrapping, alternating between anticipation and frustration, my suspicions grew. And by the time I tore the last piece of tape off the box to reveal a Tupperware covered in industrial strength tinfoil, the jig was up. I opened the container and found a partially thawed casserole. My mother had attached a yellow Post-it with the words Nudelkugel written on it, and beneath that was a stick figure family, one of which had a giant belly, and another that I think was supposed to be a dog, but looked more like a dead rabbit. I put the kugel aside for my husband, Chris. Though not the intent, this half-thawed kugel made me feel like a failure. I had failed at keeping my household running, but even more, I had failed at the very essence of womanhood. How was it that I could be so determined and brave, quitting my New York City job, joining AmeriCorps, moving to the country without knowing a single soul, but the one thing that I had been born and bred for, making babies, literally knocked me down. Then I remembered my vow to be kind to myself. I called my mother to thank her for the package. The first words I blurted out were, "I think it's time for you to come for a visit." My mother turned out to be the one person who showed up, knew what to do, and had the best advice. Maybe even better advice than my father might have had. The last few weeks, I had noticed a minute shift in my relationship with her. Sure, we were still pushing each other's buttons, but we were talking more too. How had she become so smart after all these years? Had she spent my long, insufferable youth waiting for me to come around, filled with frustration, feeling that nobody appreciated her? Regardless, she continued to do what she had always considered her job, caring for her family, no matter how defiant or selfish we were. This kugel was not just noodles and oil, and it didn't matter that I couldn't eat it. The main ingredient, the only one that truly mattered, was pure, organic love. The next day, she was at my door. I lowered the volume on the television when I heard the familiar thump, thump, thump of my mother schlepping her schlock store suitcase up the steps. She came in the house melting from the heat, and with one awkward swing, threw her suitcase up on the pink and blue striped chair. Hands on her hips, trying to catch her breath, she turned to Chris, who had picked her up at the bus stop, and said, "Open it." She pointed at the suitcase. He thought it was a joke. I could see from the look on his face that he was in no way prepared to unpack his mother-in-law's delicates. It was only when she insisted, between hyperventilating breaths, that he coaxed the zipper around its track and then quickly took a step back as if expecting a cobra to jump out. There was not a single item of clothing in this bag. Instead, it was filled with meat. My mother fluttered her lips and collapsed in the chair as though she had just completed the New York City Marathon. "Ma, I'm a vegetarian." "Well, I don't know what to make you. You don't eat anything." "That must be an entire cow." "You do this to torture me." My mother wasn't trying to be overdramatic. One of the biggest ways she showed her love was through food. It really was torture for her that my diet was so limiting, and the one thing she could do in times of hardship, cook, wasn't going to help. But by late afternoon, she had moved on from meat to other pressing domestic matters. "You want I should use bleach on your colors?" she asked as she hefted a huge basket of laundry on her hip. "We don't have bleach." "I brought my own." "You brought your own bleach? From Brooklyn? They let you on the bus with bleach?" "How do they know? They didn't strip search me at Port Authority." "It's color safe." I had no words, but it did make me think, what exactly is color safe bleach? Is it even bleach at all? How do they get the whitening agent out? A dirty pile of laundry had spurred the deepest philosophical musings I'd had in months. After this, I'll do the floors. I brought something for that too, she called out as she left the room.
I love both those passages, and they're actually pretty illustrative of what it's like to read your books. So I'll start with super softball. Why did you write these books? Did you know you wanted to write them immediately? Was it a cathartic necessity? What drew you to tell these stories that are pretty personal? And anyone can go first.
So for me, when I was thinking about having a family, because I didn't have this mythical maternal instinct, my biological clock was not ticking. I was kind of wondering what was wrong with me as I was heading into my mid-30s. So I was looking for, memoirs about the emotional journey into motherhood to see if I could find myself in those pages and find someone that I recognized. And I realized that there really is kind of a dearth of motherhood stories. Excuse me. And there's this old adage, to write the book that you want to read. So I kept that in mind as I decided to have a baby, and was, kind of chronicling it as I went along to process my own feelings, like why I was so surprised, why I was feeling anxious, why I didn't expect to feel this way when I was expecting. And then, it occurred to me that if I was in search of these stories, maybe other people were too, because, sharing these kinds of things is how we make ourselves feel less alone, less like anomalies. So it became important to kind of now curate everything that I had written into like a product, like a memoir.
How about you, Aileen?
Yeah, so I wrote this book because I wanted to give light and space to my trauma. I was holding it in for so long, and I needed to release it out in the world. And in doing so, it opens up the conversation for others to tell their stories. And interestingly, I've been seeing this happening. My book just came out March 1st, so it's out 2 months, and people have been coming up to me that I don't really know. And it's really funny because at the gym, it seems to happen at the gym a lot, like where women are just working out and they've heard about my book, and we might be acquaintances, and they're like, oh, I've heard about your book. I've been meaning to pick it up. And it starts this whole discussion about trauma that people are holding on to, and they're telling me their stories, and it's so cathartic. And that's what I want. I want people to feel less alone, and I want women to feel that they can advocate for their needs and be heard, and that they don't have to struggle through motherhood, through pregnancy, and really give us the chance to talk about it and tell our stories.
Yeah, I found that too, that it almost like publishing these books feels like an invitation in a way for like other people to then reciprocate and share. Like if you are willing to be so vulnerable and to share, like then you must be kind of a welcome ear. And so they'll approach me too. And even before I wrote the book, because I had some postpartum depression, and I was kind of like trying to feel out how other people felt after pregnancy. And that, I'd kind of be like, I'm not sure I'm attached to him the way I should be, like when he was like 3 months old. And like, as soon as I would admit anything, I could like see the curtain drop on their faces and be like, I didn't love my son till he was a year, and like say these like brave, scary things, but that they'd probably been holding on to because like not sure that anyone would accept them. Like there's so much fear of being true and saying these scary things out loud. And then as soon as, you're willing to do it, it kind of gives permission.
Yeah. And I want to dig into that and the sort of the implications of that. There's a question in the chat that actually dovetails nicely with what I would just wanted to ask. So the question in the chat is, I'm curious if you both keep a journal and use that as a base for your memoirs, or if you wrote the books by remembering back without any pre-existing journal entries. And what I want to tack onto that is sort of, you both have very different processes. You're right. I mean, maybe not, maybe you were making a lot of notes, Aileen, but you write it sort of from a retrospective voice and sort of looking back on it, and you're sort of in the trenches as you do it. What was the process like for both of you?
So this is a great question, because one of the ways I got through 5 months of bed rest was by keeping a journal. And I want you to think about, like, I was flat on my back. I wasn't allowed to move. I wasn't allowed to really sit up. I had to keep my hips up. And so I could only write like 2 or 3 lines. And I would do that every day. And I would actually email, this was before texting, and I would email them to my friends and family as a way to be like, hey, I'm still here alone in this old farmhouse. Don't forget me. And this is what my day is. And sometimes there were funny things. Sometimes it was sad. And so that's how this book started. This book actually started with those journals. And the very first version of the book had the journal entries on the top of each chapter. And, then the decision was made to be like, well, you don't really need the journal entries because you're kind of telling them in the story itself. So journaling was a huge part of my pregnancy.
So then would you say that the majority of the book writing came recently, like just based off those journaling, or was the majority of the book kind of salvaged from that time?
So the journals were really jumping off points. And I didn't write the book. I didn't start writing the book until 5 years later, when my son was 5 years old, because I was really struggling for so long with postpartum depression, postpartum anxiety. And it's only when I just started to claim the story and claim some time for myself and remember who I was as a writer that I said, I have a story to tell, and I think it could help others. And so that's when I began writing this book.
Yeah, for me, it was I had heard, that you forget things like that even like biologically, that, a hormone is released to kind of brain, like erase your brain so that you could even go through labor again. So I was kind of mindful of like, I didn't want to forget. And like, even like some things that are so visceral, like the terrible nausea that I had, like when you're chronically ill, there's something about being in that moment that then is kind of sanded away when you're healthy again, when you're well. Like you kind of, you can forget how desperate and urgent and despairing it is. So I made sure so I was writing in the time, and like also kind of as a way, like I said, to process what I was going through and as a coping mechanism. And I would just like title it the week that I was in. And it kind of felt like someone stranded on an island being like day 32, like week 38. And I'm glad that I was able to approach it that way because and all of it was written in time except for the labor, which I wrote like 3 days later at home. I made sure to just write it, take some time and just write it out so I wouldn't forget it all. And I'm glad that I did that because I know that there are definitely some experiences like the postpartum depression that I think I would have revised. Like I would have had a hard time writing in retrospect when I loved my sons so fiercely, to like remember like that, how the feeling of not feeling that connection. And even when I was reading it through to revise, I had to like catch myself and not airbrush any of that truth. Like, even though it was painful for me to see myself say that, to see myself say that, like, I feel disconnected. Like I could die and like he'd be just as fine without me, because what kind of mother am I? Like all those, like those are kind of, ugly, like hard things. So I'm glad that I put it down in the moment, because I don't think I would have been able to relocate that feeling once the love had been established.
And this is a selfish question, but also I'm sure there's a lot of writers in the room right now. Are we talking manual journal? Or are we talking typing for both of you?
I always type. It's always computer.
Yeah, I was typing mostly also. Yeah, because I was actually just typing directly into emails, and then I think I actually went back and found those emails and copy pasted them, because at the time I was like, who wants to remember bed rest? Like I it was and absolutely counting the weeks, like counting the hours and the days, and it's amazing how small our worlds get when we're struggling with pregnancy and high-risk pregnancy and all of these things that happen to our bodies. And it's like, okay, I'm not, I've been nauseous for like 3 weeks. I can make it, till tonight or whatever, so time becomes so much smaller when.
Yeah, it really stands still when you're going through something like that. To be at the beginning of like your bed rest or the beginning of my nausea and think like there's 12 more weeks of this.
Right.
Like it just seems endless. Like how it's like, how do you get through that? Like how are you able to see joy through that lens?
So, so talking about seeing, there's something I want to read. Alena, you know, the beginning of your book is sort of the wrestling with the idea of even thinking about having a child. And you describe how you didn't have an appreciation for how monumental the act of creation is before going through pregnancy and birth yourself. And you talk about, I don't know if you're on the subway or no, you're not in New York, you're in Gloucester. Well, anyway, you were somewhere and you saw a pregnant woman and you said you saw her without seeing her. And when I read that sentence, I was like, that's exactly what these two books are about. And to some extent, what my book was about. It's about making the unseen seen. Can you talk about why we need to do that and you know, what the impact of that is?
Yeah, I mean, I think that before I got pregnant myself, like the perception that I had of pregnancy was just so singular. It was just like this kind of magical journey that you go on, like the kind of fulfillment of your biological destiny, and that it's satisfying and rewarding, and so I was just kind of blindsided then by how grisly it can be and how like despairing and debilitating, and like that those stories had never been communicated to me, and I don't know, like I'm still trying to figure out why, but I think it's because it's either that we have a tolerance for women experiencing pain, or that we just like don't want to look at women's pain and admit it and speak it out loud because we can't handle it. And I think we need to have more stories like this so we become more comfortable discussing it and being transparent, and so that other women are not blindsided and can come to these decisions with all the information that is available to them.
How about you, Aileen? Sort of, you know, you talk about bed rest. I don't think people understand exactly, like it just sounds like you're going to lay down. That does not go into the psychological, you know, torture chamber that it is. So was that something that you really wanted to, because that's something I haven't seen a lot written about.
Right, well, absolutely. So that's part of the problem. So pregnancy is supposed to be this glorious time where we're glowing and we're happy and, you know, and it's so spiritual. And then if it's not like that, we feel shame around that. And so we're not, you know, we're supposed to be so grateful that we're pregnant and we're bringing life into the world. And we can have more than one feeling. Women are complex people. We can feel pain, feel shame, and feel suffering, but also be very grateful for being able to have a child. And I don't think that we spend enough time talking about that. And so when I found out that I had to be on bed rest for 5 months, and the first thing I did, of course, as someone who's a journalist, is I Googled bed rest and started doing all this research. And there's almost virtually no studies on bed rest, especially back then, you know, a couple of years ago. And now there is, and they're finally starting to say, maybe it's not such a good idea. So that's what the studies are finally coming out and saying, and not to just carte blanche put women on bed rest for every single thing. And I don't want to give too much of my story away for readers, but there is a point in the book when one of the doctors is like, I never thought you needed to be on bed rest. And I was like, I just gave up my life, my career, my marriage fell apart, the house is crumbling around me, but you weren't sure. And I don't think enough attention is paid to this. But by the way, so when I did start researching this and found no studies, I was like, where are we putting our money instead? Like, where is this money on women's healthcare going? And so I Googled stupid scientific studies. And so, like, I can tell you without a doubt, Spider-Man is not real because somebody actually put money into researching this. But bed resting women, nobody seemed to be that concerned with. So that's where we are as a society. And I think that really needs to change.
Yeah, like the NIH only started funding pregnancy research in like 2017. Like that's absurdly recent. And like you have to have like so many years of research to like even come to conclusions. So yeah, to find out that you had to, tolerate something so grueling and it wasn't even it might not even be necessary it's just like an outrage. And I find the same with nausea because like the medication they have, like you have to pry it out of their hands. They're not even sure if it has negative effects, and they're not even sure where the nausea comes from. So like, how do you even cure something you're not sure where it's originating? So like, it's all just kind of guesswork that don't even feel that committed to finding out for sure for like a population that's like almost 50%. Like we'll have to go through this. Like it's so relevant and yet so easily kind of tossed aside as like, well, most women have nausea, or like, what, like, why don't you stay in bed for 5 months just in case? Like we're not sure it's absolutely necessary, but what's to ask you to sacrifice that?
There's so much that's intrinsically wrong with the way women are perceived and their healthcare is perceived. Not, starting from the very way we speak about healthcare. I was told that I had an incompetent cervix. So suddenly I'm like there's a part of my body that's incompetent, or then there's geriatric pregnancy and all of these terms, right? So, I mean, if we have to change the dialogue first, and then we have to feel empowered to speak up, ask the right questions, and not feel, we're going to feel what we feel, but to put our shame aside and say, hey, I deserve answers and I deserve to be seen and heard. And how do we do that? How do we make that happen? That's the big question.
And I think that speaks to what you were saying, Alena, about, women's pain. We also haven't been given a language. We haven't been given terms. We haven't been given medicines. So it is, the things we're talking about are still very visceral and primal. And, there isn't like, it's not like high blood pressure where everyone has a language around it, but it always struck me through my pregnancies and through writing my book that it's just bizarre that we have this sense that this is the most natural, blissful thing. I mean, you're growing like another human from like cells inside your body. You're going to nourish them from your body for 9 months. Then you're going to, push them out through an opening that's like this big and their head is like this big. And then learn how to like take care of a living being. Like, why would that be easy? Why would that be like, why would that not be filled with like blood, sweat, and tears?
Yeah.
Do you think that, I mean, your books are a part of, a larger, and we have a question from somebody about other pregnancy or motherhood memoirs, but do you think it's changing? Like, do you think that, did you guys have trouble getting these books published, or did people immediately say, yes, like there's a market for this?
So this book for me took 10 years, it was a 10-year journey to get it published. And I think that it's a much better book because it took 10 years and I got to revise it and fine tune it. But I think that slowly we are starting to have a conversation, but I think it's very, very slowly. For example, I was just reading about implicit bias in healthcare and how, and this goes back to women's pain and how women's pain isn't taken seriously. And even more so for people of color when they go to the doctor and they're dismissed. And so this has to change. This is what has to change. The idea, there was this idea in the 80s and 90s about mothers who can do it all. They can pop out kids, they can work 9 to 5, they can be happy and have this whole, everything they've ever wanted. And I think that's a myth. I don't think that's true. And I think we have to acknowledge that when we have a family, we have to give certain things up for a while, or we have to have things in place that are going to support us. And so so the question becomes like, how do we have the support, and how do we get the government and doctors to hear us and provide the support? And what does that support look like?
Yeah, I think we're seeing the results of that too, as birth rates are declining. I mean, like women are seeing like this is a difficult thing to do. Like it's like there isn't enough support for me to do it all. So like, I'm going to have to make some decisions, and people are making decisions. Back to your question about publishing. So like, my novels came from a big traditional publisher. And then this came from a small publisher. So like that, they are thinking, you know, like the big traditional publishers are thinking like sales, and I guess it didn't, like, they thought perhaps like there wasn't a market for it. Like, so part of me thinks that it is changing, because I keep seeing more mother stories. Like there's been a lot of great mother fiction this year, and there continues to be, and mother nonfiction. So I think the tides are turning. But a few years ago, like when I was pitching this book, like there was still kind of that resistance of like, where does that belong on the shelf? Like, is there space for this? Is there need for this? Which is like kind of infuriating, because like, of course there is, like, but that had been my experience.
Yeah. So a flip side of what we're talking about is the shame that can come from, there's such lack of support, lack of information, lack of open dialogue. And so therefore, and yet we put moms on pedestals. And so we expect so much. And then in the middle of that, you have your experience. And like you said, Aileen, I loved, you know, the one thing I had been born and bred for knocked me down. And you talk about self-loathing. And I know, Alena, maybe you can talk a little bit about the epidural section where it was like, why do we prize this, you know, this experiencing pain? And there's so much shame. And how do we, you know, what is that part of why you wrote these books? And how do we help reduce it?
Yeah, so the epidural section that you're referring to, it was kind of amazing. Like, as I had, or like even myself, I'd been programmed to feel that way. Like when you ask a woman, like, did you use an epidural, or like, did you have to get an epidural? Like, it's almost like, did you get 100% on this test? Or like, did you like need a handicap? Like I feel it myself, like, even though I know how ridiculous it is, but it's like built into my brain that like you get more points if you were able to experience the full spectrum of pain. Or like the C-section, like, did you have to get a C-section? Like there's like a little bit of, you didn't kind of complete the whole thing there, which is just absurd. Like nobody would ask you to have any other surgery or any other medical experience without like the pain medication, without, like, no one would have you like get a root canal and be like, oh, did you need the anesthesia though? Or were you able to do it without? Like, it's just so ridiculous. But we do kind of like, and like with breastfeeding and stuff, like if someone decides that breastfeeding is a struggle, like that kind of feels like a failure too. Like, they're like, oh really? Because your mom was able to do it for a full year and you can only do it for 2 months. Like it doesn't make sense at all, because everyone's experience is so different. So like you can't compare apples and oranges. Yeah, we do just seem to like expect women to tolerate as much as possible and then kind of score them on it.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's so much judgment around pregnancy and motherhood and what we're capable of, and how we have to just suck it up and not talk about our pain. And, you know, I think about the generations that came before us, our mothers, our grandmothers. There's a scene in my book where my mother, and it's towards the end of my book, and, you know, I'm on bed rest because I have these monster fibroids. And I had no idea, no one ever told me. And then there's a scene in my book where my mother's like, oh yeah, I had fibroids. And I was like, wait, what? and she's like, yeah, I had to have surgery and all of this stuff. And it's just something that women don't talk about, and especially generations before us. So we're really the ones who are saying, okay, you know what, we're not going to suffer and struggle silently. We can help each other, we can support each other, and we can be there for one another. And so how do we open up this conversation, and how do we do this?
Yeah. And like we mentioned before, just like the language, like if you're asking another woman for a tampon, you're like, you're doing it in a whisper. Like, did you have a tampon? Like, we all have periods, we all have tampons. Why are we lowering our voice? Or like, I'm still trying to teach myself, like when I refer to my, you know, my son, when I talk to my son, I say penis, like very clearly, no shame, like, you know, what, dab your penis, whatever. But like, I can't bring myself to say vulva. I don't know why. It's like I have to like work against this programming, and I'm going to have a daughter. So like I'm going to have to use that word freely. But only recently even did I realize that that's the right word. Like I had been saying vagina for so long. So like it's like we don't have the language. We haven't been taught the accuracy and like and to use it so fluently.
Yeah. So speaking of your son, I kind of want to get into, you know, and we could be here for 3 days talking about, you know, all the challenges related to pregnancy and motherhood. But there's also like this interconnection between the beauty of being a mom and like the inevitable sacrifices that you make because you love that child. And then what society expects you to do. And it's a very fine line. And, but there was this section, Aileen, where you're talking to your friend Watson, who I loved. I was like, I want to hang out with Watson. I think we all need a Watson. And so you're you're talking with him about bed rest, and he's basically telling you that he's surprised you made it, like that he's surprised you were able to put your life on hold and put your needs aside and stay on bed rest. And I think you said something like, that makes me a sucker. I don't know. You had something what does that make me? And he says to you, that makes you a mother. And it felt like a very validating moment because you were having a lot of doubts. And so how do we own what is so beautiful about creating a life and being responsible for that life and giving things up willingly, and then not have to buy into the extra BS of sacrifice? And, you know, like, how do you see that balance?
Well, so you had sent me this article from Jessie Klein, who wrote for The Cut, and she writes about motherhood as the hero's journey and what that means. And that really resonated with me because, you know, we as a society think, okay, we're stepping out of our careers, out of our lives, we're giving up our lives. And that was the hero's journey. And then we're just here making babies. And so she spins it to say, hey, you know what? Motherhood is the journey. That's the hero's journey. Mothers are the heroes, right? Because of what they're giving up, because of what they're sacrificing. And this is a journey in and of itself. And I thought that was so powerful. And I think if we can reframe that and say, this is the important work that we're doing, right? So, and how do we do that and keep the essence of who we are aside from just mothers, right? So how do we encompass all of that? And I think that's what we have to keep discussing and figuring out.
Yeah, so like putting like the same value on the work you do inside the house as outside. And it's so true that like all, you know, how like the term housewife, like or like domestic, it's all just like minimizing the work that's done inside. And the government support it reinforces that by like not providing the space for you to do the work inside the home.
Right, absolutely. I think universal healthcare, universal childcare, those are all things that are desperately needed. And, you know, making sure that our healthcare professionals really take us seriously and respect us and respect our lives.
Yeah, I really loved the hero's journey. And she matches it up. This was an article by Jessie Klein. I think it's an excerpt from an upcoming book of hers that was in the Cut, New York Magazine's online section. And it was about how we think of motherhood as like giving up everything to like just feed your kids soft cookies. She talks about her daughter's toddler cookies, but that it's a journey inward, and all of Joseph Campbell's, you know, moments of self-doubt and understanding and epiphany happen within the context of motherhood, which I think is beautiful, and I think is what you guys are writing about. Do you think there's room? Do you think that by broadening the stories around motherhood, we broaden the stories around what it is to be a woman too? Because, you know, obviously there's for those who choose not to have children or aren't able to for whatever reason, that's a whole nother shame. Like you said, this was the thing your body was born and bred to do. And then they get shamed they perceive that they have not fulfilled the ultimate expression of being a female. So I'm wondering if in dissecting motherhood and telling broader stories about motherhood, we can at the same time broaden what it means to be a woman, what it means to be female. And especially if you identify as female, but maybe you weren't born into that body.
Yeah, I think part of the problem is that we've only, sorry, Aileen, is that we've only kind of been presented with one story. And so we've had to try to fit ourselves into that story or admit to ourselves that we don't fit. So I think, there are as many mother and women stories as there are mothers and women. And so the more that is shared, the more that's consumed, the more that's out there freely available, the more, kind of multidimensional and accurate this perception becomes.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. Absolutely. And I think that it's not just motherhood, because like you said, not everybody becomes a mother. It's womanhood, and it starts with reproductive health and talking about our body parts, talking about the shame that we carry. And it starts, it can start with, our periods and pregnancy and go all the way through perimenopause and menopause. And these are, because I write about that as well. And then, these are things that we don't talk about, and not to get away from our subject here, but I just read in the New York Times recently that they study menopause for 1 hour in medical school. This is something every woman in the world experiences, and that's the amount of time they give it to. And so it's really just about us as women. And yes, talking about motherhood in all of these ways and being raw and vulnerable and honest opens up the discussion. And I think it helps everybody in doing so. And not just women, by the way. I think it helps men. A lot of men have actually, surprisingly to me, have read my book. And we own a lawn and power equipment store. And so we are stocking the book there. And all of these like burly landscaper guys, like with big tractors, are buying this book. And I think it's amazing that men are interested in this. And that's also really important, because we have to get men on board with understanding our bodies and what.
Yeah, I mean, it must be really hard for them too to watch like the woman they love going through something that they can't access, they can't really help with, and they also don't understand and haven't been told about or prepared for. So yeah, it only could benefit everybody.
Yeah. Okay. I don't want to ignore, I don't want to neglect the questions in the chat. So somebody asked if you have a favorite memoirs of pregnancy or motherhood.
Alena, do you want to go first? I'm going to think about this because I have quite a few. So
I really appreciated this book called Maybe Baby when I was like thinking about motherhood, because it has a section for women who decided to have kids, were still torn, and then decided not to have kids. And so it had like this whole kind of, from all angles. So that helped me as I was going through it. I mean, expecting better is just kind of like, canon at this point, but that was really helpful for me in kind of discerning what restrictions I've been told are really significant, and which ones are just kind of like recycled because they haven't found out, another alternative. Strong as a Mother, like I just read through this Kate's book. That was really affirming and instructive. And I wish I had it the first go around. And we didn't get to talk about it as much in this session, so I hope everyone will check it out, and it makes a great baby shower gift. I have
it right here. Everyone should have this book. Every pregnant woman should have this book. I wish I had this book. It's an amazing book.
Yeah, and I love how all three of our books have like such clever play on words for the titles. Like,
yeah, I was worried they weren't going to let me keep mine. But
oh, really?
Well, the implied cussing, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it's amazing. For me, I really enjoyed The Middle Place because it was about not only being a mother, but encompassed taking care of her father and her relationship with her father. And that a very strong thread in my book is my relationship with my father and the grief that I experience while I'm on bed rest is, when I haven't allowed myself to grieve his death. And so I'm finally it's like a few years later, I'm staring at the ceiling and that's all I can think about is my father. And I finally processed this relationship. And so that book really resonated because it had both those threads as well, motherhood and the relationship with the parents.
Okay, I'm typing those in the answers so people can see them. And another question was, do you think Indigenous women may have access to more useful plant medicines and support in the community? And I suppose you could broaden that out to, you know, other cultures having a different approach to pregnancy. Is that something you guys looked into or ran across in your work?
So I think that different cultures support women in different ways. And a lot of cultures do it much better than we do here. And we have this nuclear family. We're not together. Like my mother was far away, you know, and she could come visit. And I think in cultures in which women support other women, because that doesn't happen in this culture nearly enough, in our culture. When women can support other women and be around them and help them. And I was even fantasizing this morning, like what happens if every time there's a pregnant woman in the community, all the other women in that community support her, not just bringing her meals or doing a meal train, but talking to her and processing and sharing their experiences. What would that look like? And being there and saying, okay, this is when you sleep. We're all taking, you know, this idea of the extended family has dissipated. And I think that's been really problematic because we have no support. We're completely alone. We don't have elder women to tell us that this is normal or this is not normal and give us advice. So we're flying blind in a lot of ways.
I just want to point out that a lot of people are answering this question about favorite memoirs and also offering podcasts and other things in the chat. So everybody should make sure to check that out. Okay, we don't only have a little bit of time left. What questions do you wish people would ask you about your book that they don't? What do you want to talk about that nobody has asked you?
That's a good question. I think, you know, I've had a lot of interviews and it's run the gamut. A lot of people have asked a lot of questions. I think I want people to feel more comfortable asking me about shame and the grief that I was feeling, and really just keeping that conversation going about the raw vulnerability that we experience when we go through a difficult time.
Yeah, I can't come up with I can't think of a good answer. I feel like I've been asked so much. But I agree that, like, I think, you know, sometimes people are reluctant to ask questions that they think might embarrass, you know, or make you feel ashamed. But like, that's like the whole point of putting the shame out there is to destigmatize it. So yeah, there should just kind of be like a more kind of, you know, fair ground.
Okay, so I'm going to follow up and ask a question that is a little more sensitive, which is for both of you, but different. Well, one applies to both of you, one just to one. But Aileen, you talk a lot about the struggle that you and Chris went through. How did he feel? Did you show it to him? Did you get his buy-in to publish it? How did he feel about how he was portrayed and having his dirty laundry? Because it sounds like he's a little more buttoned up than you are.
Yeah.
Put out in the world. What was his reaction?
Yeah, so it's true. My husband's very stoic, very private, very quiet, and I am all out there. I would meet you on the street and be like, "Let me tell you about my fibroids. You know, I'm gonna talk about my uterus right now." And so he read the book. He had read like little parts of it, but he had, from the very beginning, he's like, "Write your story. Don't worry about me," and I appreciated that. And you know, he read the story as soon as that I got an acceptance, like, okay, now you have to read it. And he ended up reading it 3 times because he loved it so much. And then there was one day when, and it's good because he can laugh at himself as well, you know. And so there was one day, and I was really nervous about it. I printed out the manuscript, and I come down in the morning, and he's like crying. He's got tears streaming down his eyes, and he's laughing hysterically, and he can't stop. And I'm like, "What are you reading?" And he's like, "I'm reading about the way you described my mother and her house," because it was like this museum. And I had, you know, we'd come from such different backgrounds. Like I came from this loud family and his family is so quiet and refined. And so for him to see it through that lens, how I perceived like the first time I walked into this house, this like, it was like a palace in a, you know, a split level ranch. And so he was hysterical, laughing and crying at the same time. So I was like, okay, we're gonna be okay. Like if that's his reaction to that scene, then it's all gonna work out. And so that's, you know.
So similarly, you know, one of the really hard things you talked about writing about was not feeling bonded, which, by the way, is totally normal. And I have a whole section in my book about how it's totally normal, with some suggestions of ways you can try to do it, including, this is my favorite tip that came from a parenting expert: watch your favorite TV show with your baby next to you in the little car seat. Like, your baby's cool. You don't need to stimulate him at 4 weeks old, and you can enjoy what, you know, ER, Bridgerton, whatever your thing is, while you're with your baby, and then you're in a good, happy space with your baby. So anyway, all that to say, totally normal not to have bonding, but that's, you said was hard for you to put down. And both of you, do you think about the conversations you'll have with your sons later when they want to read this book?
That has occurred to me, and I am slightly worried about it, but I think by the time that he has any interest, if he ever has any interest in reading about this, like, we'll have such a history that, like, to know what it was like before that history, I think maybe he'll be a little hurt, or it'll be complicated, but I'm not too worried about how he'll receive that.
Yeah, I will say my mom is on this webinar, whatever, this chat, and I told her she can't ask any questions. But she sent a letter home to her parents after I was born. She was living overseas, and said, I'm afraid. And she said she was afraid of me. And I remember when she told me when I was older, you know, probably after I'd had a baby, and was like, this was a feeling I had. And I was like, oh yeah, that makes total sense. Like, I was like, I thought, you know, first of all, I know you completely love me, you know, and second of all, that sounds like a really normal feeling. And I've had many similar. So, yeah. Well, both your books are a really, like, fast read. Like, I sat down with them and just plowed through them because I was so engaged with your stories. And they're both very different, but keep you in the story. So I'm grateful that you contributed them to this world, and that we can all read them and hopefully broaden our understanding of what it means to be a mom, or try to make human.
Yeah. And thank you for your book.
You're welcome. Any last things? Leslie's coming in. Leslie, look, we're a minute before time. Are you happy?
Of course. Well, this was an amazing conversation, and I don't want to cut off any last thoughts from anyone. So if you ladies have those, please share with us.
I would just say I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you for inviting me today. And if you want to find out more about my book or the kind of writing I do on women's health issues, check out my website at aileenweintraub.com, and follow me on Twitter at Aileen Weintraub.
And I'm best on Instagram. That's Alena.Dillon is my handle. And AlenaDillon.com is my website. And I have a book coming out in the fall. So if you want to pre-order it, those are super helpful for authors. So yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, your next book's about World War II women flyers, right?
Yeah, and her daughter. So it's like a dual timeline between contemporary and...
Amazing. Can't wait to see you in 2003.
See you there. Maybe in person.
I am really hoping we're in person. Really, really hoping. Even though it's amazing also to be online. And I thank you ladies so much for being here. We do hope we're going to be in real life next year. And to mount that, we're going to need a lot more volunteers. So if you're interested in being part of the festival, please get in touch through the website. Thank you again. And I hope you ladies all have a wonderful day, and say hi to your children from us.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye, everybody. Thanks, Leslie. And thank you both.